everyone. My name is Ethan Healy. I want to thank you guys all for coming. I work for Good Fellowship Ambulance and EMS Training Institute in Westchester. I think we all know why we're here. We're in an opiate epidemic, not just here in Chester County, not just in the Commonwealth, but nationwide. I believe just last year, 97 people died of an opiate-related overdose, which is huge. People you're going to hear from tonight are all part of the Chester County Opiate Prevention Task Force. The first person you're going to hear from is Mike New. He's the first assistant district attorney with the district attorney's office. Then you're going to hear from Vince Brown, from the director of drug and alcohol, and then Kimberly Leal from the health department. I just ask if you could just hold all questions to the end. We'll all be around and to answer those questions. I think we're going to get started.
Thanks, Ethan. Good evening, everybody. I'm used to talking in front of juries, so you're my jury for the evening. This is, as Ethan said, obviously a very important problem that we're all dealing with. This is the #1 public health and law enforcement issue in America right now. There are a number of police officers in the room. There are a number of EMS emergency responders. I'm sure that all of them would probably agree that what we're dealing with right now as far as the opioid and heroin epidemic is unlike anything that we have seen before. So what we're going to try and do this evening is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how did we get here? Why is the problem as bad as it is? What is it like here in Chester County? What is it like in the state of Pennsylvania? And what's it like a little bit nationally? How did we get here over the course of our collective lives? What are we doing to get out of the situation we're in? And what are some of the ways we can attack this problem? Because we're not going to solve this problem without that team approach. If you think about over the course of your lives, issues like smoking, safe driving, those are things that have changed for the better over a generation because of creative ways to approach it. So, for example, driving an automobile. DUI laws are more strictly enforced. We have safer cars. We have better restraints in the vehicle, seat belts. We have more safely designed roadways. And as a result, automobile-related deaths in America have dropped over the past 30 years or so. Matter of fact, they used to be the #1 cause of accidental death in America. They're not anymore. Overdose is the #1 cause of accidental death in America. So if we're not all approaching this problem from a cooperative team approach, where we're bringing our own areas of expertise to this issue, we're not going to be able to work our way through it. We can't just arrest our way out of it. We can't just educate our way out of it. We can't just try and treat our way out of it. We need to do all of that together. So with that, let's start with a few basic facts. As I said, drug overdose death is now the #1 cause of death, accidental death in America. #1 cause of death is still heart disease, but the #1 cause of accidental death is overdose. Prescription drugs cause more deaths than illegal drugs. So if you combine the deaths of cocaine, heroin, marijuana, methamphetamine, any drugs like that, illegal street drugs, they do not add up to the drugs that are causing more deaths, the prescription drugs. And for purposes of our conversation, I'm going to talk about prescription drugs as opioids generally. Opioids are essentially high-powered pain medicines. High-powered pain medicines that were designed for people who were end-stage cancer, hospice care, really powerful prescription drugs. For all intents and purposes, your body's reaction to those drugs is essentially the same as your body's reaction to heroin. So the chemical reaction in your brain when you experience that is essentially similar for all intents and purposes. That's why when people talk about this problem, they talk about it from an opioid and heroin problem. They are really hand in glove in that way. And opioids of the prescription drugs cause most of the prescription drug deaths. So that's why we hear so much about opioids, and we'll talk about why heroin is the transition that most people will experience if they are addicted to opioids. Pennsylvania now ranks 8th nationally in drug-related deaths. So that's a pretty high number, that we're 8th out of the 50 states. Why are we there? This is a really frightening statistic. In 1998, oxycodone, which is one of the prescription opioid pain pills that I'm talking about. Oxycodone, just one of a series of prescription pain pills that are collectively known as opioids. There were 11.5 tons of that drug produced worldwide in 1998. 2013, 138 tons of that drug was produced worldwide. And over 90% of those were consumed here in the United States of America. It is a market that was flooded over the span of roughly 15 years, where there was an incredible growth in the amount of these drugs that were out there in the population. I'm going to talk a lot about the economics of this, both the economics of the user, the economics of these kinds of things, because whenever I actually am doing a trial on drug dealing to a jury, I got to explain the economic aspects, because that's what drives a lot of this. And here, if you think about supply and demand, well, there's a huge supply of these drugs out there in America. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but think to yourselves right now, how many of you have prescription pills in your house or in your family members' houses? Those prescription opioids that you may have gotten when you had your wisdom teeth pulled, or your aunt or your mom had back surgery, and maybe you only needed one, but that pill bottle's still in your medicine cabinet. That pill bottle's as dangerous as a loaded gun for anybody who might come into contact with that. If it's a kid who thinks, well, you know, they're not going to hurt me. These are pills from a doctor. These are pills designed to make someone feel better. And they experiment with these drugs. We've seen things at high school parties where the cost of admission was bring a bottle of pills, dump the bottle into a bowl, and grab a handful. That's an incredibly dangerous and frightening prospect for anybody who might think about doing something like that, what that could do to their body. So these drugs are out there. They are in our homes. They are in our medicine cabinets. They are given by doctors. These are not the kinds of drugs that someone became exposed to because one day they decided, you know what, today's the day I'm going to become a drug addict. Today's the day I'm going to ruin my life. Today's the day I'm going to start a path of despair that leads to jail or an early grave. These are drugs that they came into contact with perhaps for a legitimate medical purpose, perhaps just because they came across them in a family member's home. Over 90% of people who experiment with these drugs or get addicted to these drugs end up getting them for the first time essentially for free because of a prescription or because of exposure in the home or in a family member or friend's home. Demand. Again, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but think about if I were to ask you how many people in here are on a prescription of some kind right now. 70% of the American population is prescribed some kind of drug. The number one prescription is still antibiotics. You have strep throat, you need to get rid of it, you need to feel better. You take 10 days of that and you're okay. But the number 2 and 3 prescriptions are antidepressants and opioids. So we have a nation that's being medically treated for either emotional or physical pain. And that combination is deadly for a lot of people. In my line of work, I've had contact with a number of people who are addicts. And they will often say that that first time that they took that pill or that first time that they took that hit of heroin, it was like unlike anything they've ever experienced before. Whatever it was that was bothering them went away. Well, the second time they did it, it wasn't quite as good as the first. The third time wasn't quite as good as the second. And very rapidly, it wasn't that they were doing it to feel better. They were doing it to avoid being dope sick, to avoid the withdrawal and the symptoms of coming off of those medicines or those drugs. So what we have here is a nation that tends to look to prescription drugs to treat their either mental or physical pain, and an overwhelming increase in the supply of these dangerous narcotics. You can see it is really a perfect storm for the epidemic that we are dealing with right now. So let's talk a little bit from a law enforcement standpoint. What are the most dangerous drugs in southeastern Pennsylvania? First of all, this ranking comes from HIDTA. It is the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. So it's a combination of federal, state, and local law enforcement that we participate in here in Chester County. As a matter of fact, our DA, Tom Hogan, is the chairperson right now of the HIDA. So it's a way for all law enforcement to coordinate their efforts in terms of trying to deal with drugs in the region. Because drug dealers generally stop right where the county line is, or right where the state line is. So this is an effort for all of us in law enforcement to work together. And any of the police officers in the room will tell you that law enforcement is the ultimate team endeavor. So the number 1 and 2 most dangerous drugs, in the sense of how are they impacting our families, how are they impacting our lives, how are they being trafficked in the area, are heroin and prescription drugs. And keep in mind, again, for our conversation, they are effectively the same thing because of your body's reaction. 3 and 4 are cocaine and crack cocaine. If I were to ask you beforehand, a lot of you might have thought, well, cocaine and crack cocaine are probably what I've always heard of as being the most dangerous drugs in America's cities especially. But we've seen that heroin and prescription drugs have moved beyond that. And then marijuana rounds out that top 5 list. So some historical trends. Again, over the course of our collective lifetimes, heroin has been around forever. There were opium dens 1,000 years ago. But let's talk about our collective lifetimes, and let's try to understand how we got here at this point in our lives. There was a spike in heroin in the 1970s in America. Does anybody know why?
Vietnam.
Yep, that's right. Soldiers who were in Southeast Asia saw things and experienced things and tried things that when they came back to America led to a spike in heroin. That dipped again, but we saw another spike in the 90s. That spike, anybody have any ideas about that spike? What's that?
Desert Storm.
There's a little bit of that too, a little bit of Desert Storm from soldiers, but there's also a little bit of, pardon? Oh, sorry. There was a significant part of social acceptability, generally from the media. There were heroin chic models that were popular in magazines. There were movies that kind of glamorized it a little bit. So we saw an uptick in heroin in the 90s as well. And then there was another dip, and we are where we are right now in the 2010s, and that's obviously what we're here to discuss, and I've talked a little bit about it already. But another thing that I want to talk about in these spikes is the time in between, because there are dips. In the 1980s, there was a dip in heroin in America. Anybody have any idea about why?
Cocaine.
Exactly. Have you seen this presentation before?
I'm a drug therapist.
Oh, okay. So you're exactly right. That in the 1980s, that's when drug trafficking organizations set up, or really ravaged American cities with cocaine and eventually crack cocaine. These drug trafficking organizations set up the logistical network that still exists to this day. So, you know, if you think about the city of Philadelphia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but all the great things about having a business or living in this area, this metropolitan area, also make it an attractive area for drug dealers. We have an international airport, an international seaport. We have interstates that connect us to major metropolitan areas like Washington, Baltimore, New York. All those things, just like they're attractive to legitimate businesses, make this area attractive to illegitimate drug trafficking organizations. And just like when you go to Wawa and you buy milk, that cow is not in the parking lot. Well, when you get drugs and illegal street drugs, those dealers get that heroin from somewhere. It gets to this area from somewhere. And it's that logistical network that's been in place really since the 80s in a lot of ways that law enforcement's constantly trying to root out. Now I recognize though that for everyone that we arrest, it creates a vacuum that someone tries to fill. But it doesn't stop law enforcement from trying to put drug dealers behind bars, because these are people who are trying to profit off of other people's heartache and despair. So going back to the dips that we have, there was another dip from the 1990s to 2010 or so where heroin dropped a little bit. And if you get this, I'll be very impressed. Does anybody know why there was a dip there? Pressure's on.
I know, God. I mean, I have thoughts, but...
8. 8. Because heroin in the 90s was still the kind of heroin that needed to be injected. So people became scared to death about using intravenous drugs because of AIDS, and that was partly responsible for that dip. Well, the heroin that we're seeing today does not need to be injected. Oftentimes people still do inject it because that is the fastest way to get that high, get it right into the bloodstream. But you can snort it, you can smoke it. The heroin of today, compared to the heroin of the 1970s, they're both heroin, but that's kind of like saying a 1975 Dodge Dart and a Ferrari 2016 Ferrari Testarossa are both cars. One is a little bit different than the other. The stuff we're dealing with right now is the cheapest and the purest heroin that we've ever seen in this country. So it is also the most dangerous heroin that we've ever seen in this country. Add to that drug dealers are cutting it with increasingly more dangerous drugs. You've probably heard about fentanyl, a very high-powered pain medicine, really something that's used to knock people out. They're also cutting it sometimes with carfentanil. That's something that they use to knock out elephants when they have surgery on elephants. And common sense would make you think, well, why would anybody want to use that? Unfortunately, from the user, the end user standpoint, the more dangerous the drug is and the more people who might be dying as a result of it, the more inclined they are to use it because they think it's going to be the highest high, because they're always chasing that first high. So it actually makes their product more marketable to the end user, which is completely counterintuitive to what we would all rationally think, but that's what we see with the more dangerous heroin that we experience today. So let's talk a little bit about that transition from prescription drugs to heroin. Kensington is a section of Philadelphia that we've probably all heard about. It's an area in I'm going to say it's along the river, but a little bit north of Old City, if you're familiar with that at all. It's only about 6 miles from City Hall. It used to be a very working class area with blue-collar jobs. This is what the tracks of Kensington look like now. This is ground zero for heroin in Philadelphia, and these photos, although they're a little hard to see, are pictures that I took with my iPhone when I walked the tracks in Kensington back in January with federal and state and local law enforcement officials. All those things on the ground, those are either needles or needle wrappers from needle exchange organizations in the Kensington area. Imagine walking down a beach and then replacing the seashells with needles. That's what it's like along these tracks. And these tracks this part stretches for about 3/4 of a mile. Those drugs on the upper right-hand corner that are sitting on a coffee table right underneath one of the bridges for the roads that go across the tracks, they weren't set up that way by law enforcement for a picture. They're just there. And there are upwards of 12 to 15 shooting galleries, as they call them, set up along those tracks. Makeshift huts where people go to get injected with heroin. It's stunning and heartbreaking all at once. The director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, who was on that tour with us, talked about how he's been all around the world for his job. And the first time he walked down those tracks, he didn't think he was in America anymore. It is stunning. And it's not just a problem that's in that neighborhood. It's a problem that reaches the entire region. Because oftentimes we'll have people in the suburbs who will drive 30 minutes and they're right there at ground zero for that cheapest, purest heroin. Make no mistake though, they don't need to go to Kensington to get that. It's in our communities as well. It's in our counties, it's in our neighborhoods, it's in our schools. And this is simply a visual example of just how bad it is in the worst part of Philadelphia, where they're fighting this problem every day. So, again, going back to my economic theory of things, oxycodone. Remember, that's that pill that I talked about before, where the increase was nearly 100 tons of or pounds rather. Excuse me. There was tons. Thank you. I was going to ask you to fill that in since you mentioned no, but the oxycodone was the pill that I had talked about earlier, one of the most abused prescription opioids. So a pill is going to cost you about $1 a milligram. Most of these pills are somewhere like, for example, a Percocet, a 30 milligram Percocet is a Perc 30. On the street, the average cost is going to be about $30 for that pill. the availability becomes a problem because, okay, yeah, you have a prescription or your friend or relative has a prescription, but what do you do when that prescription runs out? Say you're popping a few of these pills a day to get your experience. Well, when you run out of these pills, you are now in a situation where you got to come up with something that's a pretty expensive habit. $30 every time you're taking that pill, and maybe you're taking 4, 5, 6, 10 pills a day. That's going to get really expensive really quickly. So that's when the transition happens to heroin. Note the price, $5 to $10 per dose. Now, I'm no math expert, but 20 to 30 per pill versus $5 to $10 per dose of the purest, strongest heroin we've ever seen before. You can see why people transition from prescription pill abuse to heroin abuse.
I think it's actually even breaks down to be cheaper than that because in one bundle they can shoot through a few times.
Yeah, depending upon your level of use, yeah, the bundle is a series of packets of heroin, and a series of packets of bundles is a rack of heroin.
Right.
So there's the way it's sold is it depends upon where you are, how much you're using, but the cost can be very, very affordable relative to the cost of the pills that are oftentimes the gateway for people who are experiencing heroin. There are other problems, obviously, with heroin as well. The adulterants, we talked about fentanyl and carfentanil and other things. You have no idea what's in there. The infectious disease, and obviously the fact that these are illegal. A lot of people who are addicted to this drug do things to fuel their habit. Or they get caught with these drugs and they're in contact with law enforcement. So you can see how easy it is for people who are addicted to come into contact with law enforcement, and then they are in the criminal justice system. So that's an example of, from a financial standpoint, why people go from prescription pills to heroin. I talked a little bit about Philadelphia before, but Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia is actually viewed as having the cheapest and purest heroin. So we have, not only does America now have the cheapest and purest heroin in our collective history, the city of Philadelphia is one of the key cities in America, certainly on the East Coast, for the cheapest and purest heroin of all of the country. So from the law enforcement folks who I walked down Kensington with, they were telling stories about people hitchhiking from halfway across the country to get to this area. So we are right here in suburban Philadelphia dealing with this. Now, Chester County, these statistics are for 2014 and 2015. We had 59 overdose deaths in 2014 and 63 in 2015. As Ethan said, the number was over 90 in 2016. So the numbers are continuing to go up. I put Delaware County up there for point of comparison. The numbers are even more staggering there. They had 118 and then 202 in 2015, and it's gone up again. Now, part of that might be because they border Philadelphia. We have Montgomery County and Delaware County between us and Philadelphia, but we're still in that same orbit. So we're fortunate in the fact that our numbers are not as high as some of our neighboring counties, but let's not forget, every one of these numbers is someone. It's someone's kid, someone's brother, someone's sister, someone's parent, someone's loved one. Each one of these numbers is a human being, and each one of these numbers matters. Chester County is 53rd out of the 67 counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but unfortunately we have seen the numbers steadily increase, so we must remain vigilant. Some of the things we're doing to try and address this. Well, I did talk about the law enforcement aspect of it. Aggressive law enforcement efforts to get drug dealers. This is one of the drug dealing organizations that we here in Chester County took down. This one was actually about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. This had direct connections to a drug trafficking organization in Mexico. There was another drug trafficking organization that was brought down about a month ago that you may have read about in the papers. This is where the cops and the detectives and law enforcement and prosecutors work together to try and eliminate organizations that are selling these drugs, that are profiting off of other people's heartache and pain. Again, we're not going to be able to arrest and prosecute our way out of this, but arresting and prosecuting the people who are dealing these drugs is a critical component of what we're dealing with. Another thing that we're doing is trying to educate students, kids. One of the things we do is NOPE, Narcotics Overdose Prevention and Education. It's a program that goes into the middle schools, the high schools, and then has an event that night for parents. to try and start that conversation and try and encourage kids. One, to make sure that they know what the problem is, but two, to be the hero. Try and save your friend's life. Try and get help for your friends. So this is an effort for a number of folks. There has a law enforcement component. It has a component for people who have lost children and loved ones to this. And it's a very impressive program. I've been in a number of auditoriums where the kids, 400 kids, are quiet because they're seeing just how horrible this is. And the entire auditorium is filled with pictures of children who died as a result of this. It's a stunning presentation, and it has been very effective, we hope, with some of our children here in the county. Prescription drug drop boxes. This is an initiative where there are free disposal boxes at about 20 different locations throughout the county, predominantly at police stations, because obviously people are disposing of unwanted prescription drugs and other drugs in these boxes, so we need to make sure they're safe and secure. But there are also some at hospitals as well. We have one at Paoli Memorial Hospital. And the idea here is to eliminate some of that supply. So the pills that you don't need anymore because you're okay from after you got your wisdom teeth pulled and you don't need all those pills in your house, safely dispose of them at the prescription drug box. We've had them for about 2.5 years. This has seen steady growth as well. First year and second year, I think we had maybe about 2,000 pounds. Last year, we had over 8,000 pounds of pills that were taken out of these boxes across the county. They're picked up by detectives, safely disposed of, so they don't go into the wrong hands and they don't go into the water table. And you can get a list of where these are located on the DA's office's website, or if you were just Google Chester County drop boxes, you'd be able to get them. We also have a flyer over there that has information about it as well. And Kim will talk a little bit more about the Drug Overdose Task Force and how we're trying to approach this effort and this problem in a way that we can all bring that expertise together. Good Samaritan law. This is a law that was brought about to try and encourage someone to call 911 to save their friend's life. The idea that if you and I are both using drugs and I experience an overdose, if you're going to be a good Samaritan and call 911 and stay with me and give your name and provide the information that they need to try and save my life, that you're not going to be prosecuted because you happen to have a small amount of drugs on you as well. Now, if you're my drug dealer, that's different. We're going after you. But this is something that if two people are going out using drugs and one's dying, the other one should be encouraged to call the police. Narcan. This is something that Ethan's going to talk a lot about as well, but this is a life-saving tool that is in every police vehicle in Chester County. There are 46 municipal police departments. There are 2 state police barracks. Every single cop on the street has this in their car when they're responding, so that when they get to an overdose, they can use this drug that Ethan's going to talk a lot about. And if they are experiencing an overdose because of an opioid or because of heroin, this will snap them out of it, and they can get to a hospital where they can get treatment to help save their life. It's a very powerful tool, and well over 100 lives have been saved already. Drug court. This is the other side of law enforcement's interaction with people who are dealing with drugs. I talked earlier about going after the drug dealers. It's important to go after the drug dealers. We need to put them in jail. That's where they belong. The people who are experiencing addiction, who are struggling with it, they need to have consequences, but they also need to have learning. They need to learn coping mechanisms. They need to learn skills to try and deal with their addiction. Drug court is a program where if it's someone who is in contact with the law because of their drug addiction, and they qualify for this program, so they're not a violent offender, they didn't attack or hurt someone, they can go into this program and they are under intensive supervision. They have to go to court once a week. They've got to check in. They've got to test clean. If they don't test clean or they have slip-ups, they might go to jail for a couple of days. But the judge and the probation officers who oversee this program want them to succeed. They want them in about a year, year and a half later to graduate successfully from this program. And I've seen these graduations. They do an excellent job, because not only do you get a certificate saying you graduated from drug court, but they also give them a picture, and it's their booking photo. And if you want to see someone's reaction when they look at what they looked like when they were in the depths of their addiction to now hopefully being clean and sober, it's stunning and emotional. Also, they can get their record wiped clean if they successfully complete this program. There's also prescription drug guidelines. I talked about doctors before. I'm not here to vilify doctors. Doctors have a very hard job. It's probably one of the hardest jobs you can ever imagine. And they do it for all the right reasons. They want to save people's lives. But this issue and addiction was not a major component for a lot of the education for doctors. It is now something that they are learning in medical schools. It's now something that they're learning in continuing medical education. And we have had a lot of buy-in here in Chester County. We've done grand rounds for doctors at Paoli Hospital. We've done a presentation for the Chester County Medical Society where the Commonwealth's Physician General came and spoke as well about this problem. So doctors are working with us to try and deal with this. And prescription guidelines are an aspect to that. We also have a prescription drug monitoring program. So if people are trying to doctor shop because they say they need pills because they've got a bad back, well, it's kind of hard to tell whether somebody actually has a bad back or doesn't have a bad back and they're just making that up to get access to pills. The monitoring program has that person's information in there so that a doctor can run the name securely and determine, is this someone who's gone to 4 or 5 different doctors in a week as well to try and find pills. So that's another tool that medical professionals have. Prescription guidelines are things like, for example, if you're under 21, maybe you shouldn't be prescribed these pills at all. A lot of athletes, a lot of high school athletes and college athletes get hurt. They have to have surgery. And as a result of the surgery, they end up getting these pills. Well, that's a possible exposure to something that could lead to addiction. So that's something that needs to be monitored very closely. Do you need 5 pills or do you need 50 pills? Do you really need a month and a half, 2 months worth of Percocets when you get your wisdom teeth taken out? If you only need 5, maybe you should only be given 5. And if you're going to be on these pills for over 60 days, you need to have counseling on how to deal with this so that you don't fall down that death spiral of addiction. Sadly, the problem is not going away. The supply is increasing, the availability is increasing, and the demand in use is increasing. But by knowing how we got here, by understanding how we got here, by working together and trying to use our individual expertise to address this problem from multiple angles, and by having a plan about some of the things that we just talked about, this will give us the opportunity to try and get out of the situation that we're in. But if we don't understand how we got here and we don't understand what we're dealing with, well, then we can't get out of that situation. So I appreciate you all taking time out of your schedule today to do this and to learn more about this. I'm going to hand it over now to Kim Liao to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of the Department of Health and how they are working with us on the task force as well. And I'll be available for any questions after. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mike. So Mike had the tough job of making sure that everybody's on the same page about this problem. I have the pleasure of just talking about the Overdose Prevention Task Force in Chester County, why we were formed, and what our role is. Oh, okay. That is not our role. Okay. Should I just talk about the task force? All right. Let's see how I do. Okay, so Chester County's Overdose Prevention Task Force was formed in March 2015, and the reason behind it, hopefully everybody is convinced by now through Mike's presentation that overdose is a huge issue and it's not going away unless we band together and do something about it. So we decided to start this Overdose Prevention Task Force with the support of our county commissioners in order to better coordinate multidisciplinary efforts. So, the health department was doing a little bit related to overdose, drug and alcohol services was doing a lot, district attorney's office was doing a lot, Ethan and Good Fellowship were doing a lot, and not to mention all the hospitals, drug and alcohol treatment providers, etc. So there are a lot of stakeholders involved. Everybody was interested in learning how to better help, and part of that is knowing what other organizations are doing to identify opportunities for collaboration. So we were formed in March 2015. The task force is led by Mike Noon of District Attorney's Office and Vince Brown of Chester County Drug and Alcohol, and Vince is going to speak next. The other lead agencies are the ones I mentioned, Good Fellowship, Chester County Health Department, as well as Chester County Human Services. In addition to those lead agencies, we have 30+ different organizations represented in the community. So just to give you an idea of kind of the cross-section that this task force represents, we have hospitals, we have drug and alcohol treatment providers, we have concerned community members and parents, we have human services organizations, we've got representation from educational institutions and schools. So it really is a nice broad intersection of many different agencies. Some of our most significant accomplishments to date have been, one, the education that Mike alluded to. We were able to hold a public community symposium on overdose. This was during our first year of the task force. Our focus was really to make sure that people knew that this was a problem to begin with. So we held a very successful public symposium. Tom Hogan, our DA, was there speaking, as well as other representatives. Got 100+ folks to show up and show interest in the issue. We've done lots of healthcare provider education, as Mike also mentioned, so grand rounds, continuing medical education events, as well as meetings with various hospitals and healthcare providers. Some of you may have heard of the county's Color 5K that was done, I believe, last October to raise awareness and funds to support overdose prevention. We helped coordinate some of the educational component of that event, and I imagine we'll continue to be involved in future years. In terms of what our current goals are for 2017, we'll see if I remember them all, but I know one major goal of ours is to have more of a public presence, and a large part of that is by establishing a website that kind of serves as a one-stop shop of overdose prevention efforts in Chester County. Right now, people have the option of going to Drug and Alcohol's website, Health's website, District Attorney. It's kind of scattered all over the place. We are interested in creating a website that not only provides some basic information about this problem and some strategies, but also information about our task force, where people can get in a lock zone, where people can attend trainings, as well as the different treatment resources, which Vince will talk about. So we do expect that by the end of 2017, we will be launching this public website. So that is one of our major goals. Another major goal is surrounding data. Again, data is something else that's been pretty piecemeal, so we do receive information about the number of overdose deaths from our coroner's office. However, we know that there's lots of information out there about people who overdose, go to the emergency department, and are fortunate enough to survive. We're not necessarily able to describe that population right now, so we're currently working with hospitals, with different agencies to gain access to that data so that we can have more of a comprehensive picture of overdose in the county. Another issue in terms of overdose data is that depending on the case definition or how overdose deaths are defined, we're seeing different numbers, in different places. So we want to make sure that we have a consistent statistics that all of us on the task force are able to speak to, so that we're describing the problem accurately. So that's another one of our large goals. And then our third goal for 2017 is to figure out how to better engage with our community stakeholders. In particular, we have a lot of parents or concerned community members who perhaps have a loved one struggling with addiction, who reach out to us or one of our representative agencies saying, we want to help, we want to get involved. And we figure instead of having people not know how to get involved and form their own small groups, and then we have 50 small groups across the county, let's tell people who are interested in helping about the existing opportunities to get involved. So that is another item that we're working on, and the website will be a helpful portion in terms of that. I'm trying to think if I've missed anything. I think I've pretty well covered it. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Vince Brown, who's the Director of Chester County Drug and Alcohol. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Nice job with that.
Pointers.
There might be a little reason for the slides missing. Just prior to us starting, Kim was telling us how pretty her slides were in comparison to the rest of ours. So I'm not sure what happened to them. I didn't have anything to do with it. I can't handle that kind of stuff.
It might have been jealousy, you know, these guys. I don't know.
So anyway, thank you. Good evening. Very nice to see the crowd that we have here tonight and the interest in this epidemic and the problem that we're dealing with. As Kim said, my name is Vince Brown. I'm the department head for the County Department of Drug and Alcohol Services. I've actually been with the department for 27 years. Prior to that, I worked with adult probation in the court systems. And prior to that, I actually worked with the DUI population in educating and assessing and that type of thing. I'm also a 40-year volunteer with, active volunteer with one of the local fire departments here. And I share that because it's my involvement and my work in those agencies and organizations that's really led to the perspective that I have now in comparison to where I was when I first came out of college and in my years in high school and that type of thing. And it will be reflected as we go through here, and I would certainly encourage any questions that you may have as far as some differences in thoughts or some questions and stuff, actually to ask any one of us here at the end of the presentation. My plan here is to share some information with you about what's happening in the drug and alcohol world. What kind of services are available? What are we seeing for some of the numbers, which actually Mike and Kim have referenced already? How do you access the services that are available? So I want to take time to do that to help some of you professionally, from police departments and first responders, but also personally. Statistically, 1 in 12 individuals have some sort of substance abuse disorder. And what that means in Chester County, for example, there's approximately 35,000 people in just our community here in the county that have some sort of a substance abuse issue. It could be misuse, abuse, and or addiction. And another number, and I'm not great on statistics, so I'll share one other one though that's something to keep in mind, is that 1 out of 4 of us know someone that's either suffering from an addiction, whether that be a friend or a family member. And I can tell you personally, I'm one of those individuals. And I share that with you because it's okay to do that. One of the things, in order to be able to address this issue, is to talk openly about what we're dealing with. To share, I have a friend that has a problem, how can I help him? To share, I have a family member. There's a lot of stigma, a lot of embarrassment, and that type of thing that actually keep people from getting the help that they need. So I wanted to just share that with you. Hope that this will help you both professionally and personally as we go through the presentation and can provide you some additional information. And so let me just start with some basics about Chester County. We have a significant substance abuse problem here in the county. And if you notice, I didn't use the words just opiate and heroin. We have a significant problem in general. And for those of you in the EMS world, in the police world, any kind of first responders, and families as well, excuse me, as well, you know that we're dealing with alcohol and alcoholism. We have cocaine addiction, cocaine abuse that's still going on, continues to go on. We have methamphetamines in Chester County, use, abuse, addiction. And of course, we do have the opiate and heroin epidemic. And as Mike already pointed out, that's one of the largest national epidemics that we're facing, and probably that we ever have faced in the nation. So that's not just here in Chester County, we're talking nationally. The Surgeon General actually has indicated in his report, if you saw it at the beginning of the year, this is one of the #1 priorities for him, and one of the main public health issues that needs to be addressed. This is not simply someone who's on the street, has an addiction problem or whatever. This is a public health issue, and that's how it needs to be addressed. It needs to be a comprehensive approach, as Mike has referenced before. And as Ethan will also talk about with the Narcan and some other things, this is not simply just let's arrest people or let's do this or that and that's going to solve the problem. It really does need to be something that's going to be comprehensive. This issue did not start overnight. Unfortunately, it won't end overnight. We're in the middle of it right now. And what we're not dealing with, as Mike was alluding to earlier, we're not dealing with the stereotypical junkie that we were used to hearing about and seeing, you know, back in the 90s or maybe a little earlier than that. We're talking about people of all ages. We're talking about all socioeconomic levels. We're talking about anywhere in Chester County. This goes from West Nottingham Township to Schuylkill Township. It goes from Honeybrook to the Delaware line and everywhere in between. So this is not a Coatesville problem. It's not an Oxford problem. It's not a Westchester problem. Those of you that are police officers in EMS, you can attest to the fact that you'll see it everywhere in the county. I was talking to Ethan just before this. It was interesting, just in my 40-minute ride home from here to Oxford, in one day, as I listened to the scanner, I heard of actually three different overdoses just being dispatched in that 40-minute time. And what really caught my attention was one was at the checkout line at Babies R Us. I believe it was down in Exton. So, I mean, it was definitely here in the county, and that's the only Babies R Us I know. Now, I haven't checked out the Babies R Us for a while, but I believe that's where it actually was. The overdose, excuse me, and the deaths, unfortunately, will probably continue to rise. I was asked a question earlier today in a meeting, you know, where are we? Where do you see us in not just Chester County, but the overall picture? Unfortunately, we're still, I think, on the upswing. Now, it will even out, and eventually it will start to go down, and allow that evening out and then starting on the dip again will be because of the many efforts that Mike alluded to earlier, as well as many other efforts that are going on nationally, in the state, and locally. Mike had mentioned in his presentation there's legislation that's going on at the federal level and the state level at some of the efforts. There's money that's coming out through the feds and through the state to address this issue. We've received it through my department in many different ways, to use it for treatment, to purchase Narcan, to do public education. Again, it's going to take all those types of things from many organizations to really address this problem. And Mike alluded to too, the prescription drug boxes as being a big factor right here in Chester County, the prescribing guidelines, the drug monitoring program. These are all significant efforts. And most of these have come up within the last few years. And in response to the opiate epidemic, unfortunately, because as Mike was saying before, we had cocaine addiction and we had alcoholism, and we didn't have the type of response that we're having right now. And I'm not saying it was a bad thing, but the good thing is, in a sense, we need to ride this wave now and make the public aware that there is an addiction problem and address specifically the opiates and stuff that are going on as the significant problem right now. One thing that is happening in the county, it was interesting, I was having a conversation with a young lady earlier before the meeting, that's occurring in Chester County as well as across Pennsylvania, that you may not be familiar with, but it's an effort to put in place what we call warm handoffs. And for EMS and police, you may have even more interest in this. It's something where if someone goes into an emergency room, surviving an overdose, and is medically stabilized, the focus of this effort is to then connect that person directly to treatment, whether it be assessment, to detox, or anything in between as far as levels of care, which I'll talk about in just a minute. It's in various stages throughout Pennsylvania right now, with each county developing its protocols, putting things in place, and it'll look a little different from Washington County, which has probably one hospital amongst 3 counties, and Philadelphia, which I don't know how many hospitals they have in Philadelphia, but this, so it will be based on what's locally needed. So we're also doing that here in Chester County. We've actually had a protocol in place now for many years where the hospital staff could actually get people into detox, and we're applying for federal funds through a grant to actually enhance those things. So hopefully what we'll have is someone that can actually go into the emergency rooms, meet with the individual and talk with them. As you know, some individuals that have survived an overdose may not want to go to treatment, but we can also then intervene and try to provide some information to the families as well, who often are in the emergency rooms with those individuals. We're going to try to look at, getting Narcan out to those family members and stuff, so that they have some information, they have some support, they have some tools to use to help with their loved one. So there's a lot going on. There are many challenges with what we're dealing with, but the one thing I want to stress before I get into the treatment piece of it is recovery, which is getting clean and staying clean and being well, is possible, and it happens every day. I mentioned earlier that there's approximately 35,000 people in the county that suffer some form of substance abuse disorder. The estimate, and there's no way to tell, but the estimate that I've been able to come up with in working with some experts in the field are guesstimating that there's at least 35,000 people, if not more, in recovery in Chester County. It is possible, it does happen, and we need to continue to work on those efforts so that we don't continue to see the rise in the overdoses and the deaths. We actually have people that are in recovery. And I'm not just talking about opiates and so forth at this point. I'm talking about any kind of substance abuse. So one of the things that's a major tool for us in working with substance abuse and addiction is treatment services. My department is responsible for the coordination and the planning and some funding of treatment services, as well as prevention services and intervention services. And the one thing I'm just going to talk about right now is the treatment aspect of it. We have funds that come in through our department for those individuals that don't have the insurance or other resources to help pay for treatment. We also work with individuals that may have insurance to help get them to the right connections through their insurance company so they can also get into treatment. And what I want to do is just give you a brief overview on what the levels of care are and the type of treatment, because this is available. It's here in Chester County, it's accessible, and awareness on everyone's part, I think, is really important. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. Real briefly, you can kind of break out into two main categories. We have outpatient treatment, which, if you're not familiar with that, that's something where you would, or I would go, for example, to a local counseling center in Westchester, for example. I would go in once or twice a week, have group counseling or individual counseling, but I'm at home. I'm living at home. So all those different things, outpatient, drug-free, intensive outpatient, which is where I may go to a treatment program 3 or 4 days a week for more intensive treatment. And partial hospitalization which is even a more intensive outpatient program, which is where I may go 4 to 5 times a week for 4 or 5 hours a day. Those are all where I'm at home and going into a facility during the day and the evening. The residential pieces are where I would go in and actually stay for a period of time. We have detox, which is basically a short-term type of thing. It's not really a form of treatment as much as it is to medically and so forth get that drug or alcohol out of my body to prepare me, allow me to move forward into the level of care that I need. We also have what we call residential rehab. Those are programs, if you're familiar, like Bowling Green in Chester County, Cadenzia up the road here, Malvern Institute. Again, somewhere where I would go as someone assessed as needing that level of care, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but I would go for help at that location. I would actually physically stay there. That would be where I would be. And there's all kinds of counseling and services that go with it. My family comes in for services and meetings and that type of thing. So but that's a residential type of facility, as is a halfway house. And a halfway house is basically usually following a rehab, but it's called halfway because it's treatment, but I'm also re-entering the community. So I'm looking for, where I'm working on job skills, vocational skills, going back to school, some different things, while I'm staying in the treatment facility. So it's a way of me continuing to get treatment, have my support, but also to start getting my feet wet again in the community with other supports. And the one thing at the bottom, kind of goes with both of those, medication-assisted treatment. If you haven't heard of that, you probably will. It's the big thing right now, and it's not new, but those are medications that are used specifically here to help address the opiate addiction. Things like methadone, if you've heard that, Suboxone, and now it's not a new medication, but the newest one that's being used more and more frequently is Vivitrol. So these are medications that can help either prevent or eliminate withdrawal symptoms or help deal with the cravings, so that an opiate, someone that's addicted to an opiate, can take the medication, and that will make them a lot more capable of dealing and receiving services through one of these other means. The medication itself is not the answer. Medication-assisted treatment has to be part of a full treatment regime, which includes the counseling piece. You may know of people that talk about, and I'm just giving you this because I hear it myself when I'm on the street and talking to my friends sometimes. You know, well, my friend's on methadone, and you know, he goes in, he gets his pill or he gets his liquid, and he's not going to counseling. Well, he's not on the right path. That stuff needs to all go together as a full treatment regime. Very quickly, the services that I just went over a little bit are really considered to be in a continuum of care. They're part of a continuum of care. Which you may not be able to read up there at the top square is outpatient. It goes to intensive outpatient, partial, detox, short-term rehab, long-term, and halfway house. Those are the different types of treatment that I was just talking to you about. You can see in the center what it says is basically somebody doesn't have to start in outpatient and then fail there before they can move up. This is not like you start there and you go this way. You can start anywhere in that continuum and move from one place to another based on your individual needs. And the important part that's not really specified there is there needs to be a full assessment of what my needs are versus what, you know, if Kim were to go in for an assessment, what's her needs? So that we can figure out, does Vince need to be an outpatient? And if that's the place, and we really try to get the person in the appropriate level of care and keep them there for the appropriate length of time. I won't get into insurance companies right now. So I may have an assessment and I can go to outpatient, and the important piece is the assessment continues while I'm in treatment. Because if I'm struggling and I'm only going to outpatient, they may say to me, you know what, based on what's going on with your current assessment, we really need to step you up into a more intensive level of treatment. So they may recommend that I go to rehab and then possibly onto a halfway house. Or I may go in for an assessment, the first place they put me or send me is to a detox, because I can't do much else until I'm clean and able to do that. So the short story is you can enter into the continuum at any point and move around, and it really needs to be based and is based on individual need that's assessed. Very quickly, accessing services, two different things that I've broken it down into very simply. On the left, if you're insured, if you have some sort of insurance, and that includes Medicaid, veterans benefits, commercial insurance, that type of thing, it's real easy in a sense. Turn the card over, there's an 800 number. It's either going to say, call this number for behavioral health services or for drug and alcohol services or something, but the important thing is you call that number and they will step you through or give you steps to follow in order to access treatment services. If you don't do that, this is just an FYI, you may not have your services paid. So the important thing is to call them, follow the instructions, hopefully it's going to be an assessment and go to the appropriate level of treatment. And that's your main step. If you don't have any of those resources, if you're uninsured, we have funding assistance, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that's available for individuals that don't have a resource to help pay for their treatment services. What we do is we have that person assessed to determine what level of care is needed and for the appropriate length of stay. We have assessment sites listed there, and there's also a brochure over here with some of the other information that Mike and Kim were referencing. We have assessment sites throughout the county, geographically spread out. Because if you think about the county, there's no buses, there's not an easy way to get from Oxford, where I live, to Westchester. So if everybody in Oxford had to come to Westchester to get treatment or to get an assessment, we'd really cut back on assessments and treatment. Save a lot of money, but that's not what I want to do. So we have them in Coatesville, Westchester, Kennett Square, Phoenixville, and over in Exton right now. That may or may not be enhanced, depends on the need. But those are places where you can go into any one of those and you're going to have the same assessment, be asked the same questions by someone that's approved, has the clinical knowledge and expertise to do the assessments, is familiar with that continuum that we talked about, and knows how to access our funding, for example, if it's needed. Or they'll work with you to, you may be referred from your insurance company to one of those or other places, and they'll help you get to the level of care and the treatment program that you need. There's a couple things for eligibility as far as our funding. Just real quickly, the treatment that we can fund has to be consistent with the assessment. So, and I'm not picking on judges either or the court system, but we've had judges, when I worked in probation, says, okay, Vince, you need to have your person go to a 30-day rehab and he needs to go tomorrow. Well, that's based on what the judge assessed from his perspective on the bench. Now, I spend 2 hours, hour and a half, 2 hours doing a full assessment on somebody. So the judge ordering that, he can do that, that's not a problem. But when we're going to fund somebody, it needs to be based on a clinical assessment. And we're going to put them where they need to be. Maybe it is a 30-day. Maybe it's a 90-day program. Maybe it's outpatient. And then we got to deal with the judge on that stuff. But it needs to be based on a clinical assessment. We have one restriction as far as residency. You just have to be a resident of Pennsylvania. And because of the funding that we get in through the feds and the state and different grants, they require that that money be used last. Of course, everybody wants their money used last. But so if you have other resources, our funding may or may not be something that you're able to access. And if not, we would certainly work with that individual to help them access what they need. So if you have questions regarding services or funding, we have a information and referral line there. The state, and I did not bring this, and I meant to, the state just recently implemented a hotline, for lack of better words, but a call-in number statewide, so that you can call from anywhere in the state, and those individuals on that phone will be able to work with you, whether you're calling from Chester County, they'll be able to pull up our information and say, okay, here's where you need to call to get help, here's the phone number, and if it's during normal business hours and so forth, they'll make that connection with you. If you're calling from Philadelphia and you're looking for something in Philly, they can do that. So that's now in place. This is our own internal Chester County number. So that too is in the packet of information that I've left over there for you guys. And with that, and we'll get back to questions if you have any in a little bit, but I'll turn it over to you.
My name is Ethan Healy. I work for Good Fellowship Ambulance and EMS Training Institute. We're a 911-based community ambulance service that covers Westchester as well as the greater Westchester area. Through Good Fellowship, I run a program known as Project Naloxone. I'm the project manager. The mission of Project Naloxone is to provide the training and naloxone to law enforcement agencies at no cost. Naloxone, commonly referred to in the media as Narcan, it's the opiate reversal drug. When somebody overdoses on an opioid, such as prescription opioid, oxycodone, fentanyl, Percocet, or illicitly heroin, naloxone is used to reverse the overdose and save their life. Part of Project Naloxone, there's two components to it. There's a community component as well as a law enforcement component. We hold community trainings, naloxone trainings quarterly at Good Fellowship. The goal is to educate the community on the presence of the opiate epidemic going on not just here in Chester County, not just here in the Commonwealth, but nationwide. Through those community trainings, we educate the community on naloxone, signs and symptoms of an opiate-related overdose, how to get naloxone, as well as how to administer naloxone. If you want more information on those naloxone trainings, they can be found on our website, goodfellowship.org. So the program all started in October of 2014. A law was passed known as Act 139 of 2014, also known as David's Law. Previous to this law, the only people that really carried naloxone was paramedics and in the hospital setting in the emergency rooms. Okay? Act 139 was passed in October, like I said, of 2014. It allows anybody to give naloxone to somebody they believe suffering an opiate-related overdose. It's the same Good Samaritan protection that's provided with CPR. So if you happen to come upon somebody that you believe is overdosed on an opioid, you're permitted by law to give naloxone. You cannot be sued, as long as you've acted in good faith. This law also allows naloxone to be given over the counter. So in theory, you could walk into any pharmacy and say, hey, I would like naloxone, and they'll give it to you. These are the 3 accepted delivery methods of naloxone through Act 139. The first product on the left is a nasal spray. The product in the center is an auto-injector, very, very similar to an EpiPen. This is the same delivery device that the EpiPen actually uses, marketed by Enzio. The product on the far right here is actually marketed by a local-based company in Radnor, Adapt. It's a nasal spray, very, very similar to a Flonase or a Nasonex type device. Basically, when somebody overdoses, you take the nasal spray, take the device, place it up the person's nostril, has a little plunger locks in place, and over a period of a second it sprays. Within 30 to 60 seconds, you'll see an improvement to the person's condition. So what is naloxone? Naloxone, like I said, is referred to in the media a lot of times as Narcan. It's marketed by 3 major companies, Adapt, Amvistar, and Enzio. Enzio only makes the auto-injector. Naloxone, by definition, is an opiate antagonist. It's a substance that interferes with or inhibits the physiological action of another. So in very, very simple terms, basically blocks the opioid at the receptor level from causing effect on the body. Opioids act on the mu receptor in your head, so when you overdose on an opioid, it acts on that receptor, slowing your breathing. Basically, the average person breathes between 12 and 20 times a minute. When somebody's overdosed on an opioid, their breathing actually slows down to a point where their body can't withstand that, and they eventually go into cardiac arrest. With naloxone basically stops the opioid from acting on that receptor, improving their breathing, and ultimately saving their life. So like I said, naloxone can be obtained from any local pharmacy over the counter. You basically walk into the pharmacy, say, hey, I would like naloxone, and they'll give it to you right over the counter. Those of you with health savings plans as part of your insurance benefits, it may benefit you to go to your physician, your local doctor, and get a prescription for naloxone for your insurance to pay. It's all up to what your insurance company requires. Initially, when the law first came out, it actually required you to go to your doctor and obtain a prescription. This caused a couple issues. Basically, insurance companies were refusing to pay because your parents going to get naloxone for their children who weren't on their insurance policy, and that caused some issues because the patient wasn't part of their insured. So the law was actually changed back in June of 2015, allowing naloxone to be sold right over the counter. Here are the price points of the naloxone. They actually range quite significantly. The first product on the left is about $55. That includes the pre-filled vial of the naloxone, which is already measured out in a nose piece. The product in the center is the most expensive, about $350. This product is pretty neat. It actually, as soon as you take it out of the encasing, it has a speaker inside and a recording. As soon as you take it out of the encasing, it actually activates the recording and walks you through step by step on how to administer the drug. It's pretty neat. The product on the far right is the local-based company Adapt. It comes in a duo dose pack, meaning there's 2 doses of naloxone inside the box, 4 milligrams each. Basically, up the person's nostril, hit the plunger locks in place, and it sprays. All these products are single use, and the naloxone is actually pre-measured out inside. So once they're used, they can't be used again. They have a shelf life of about 30 months. So again, keep in mind if you're looking to get naloxone, potentially you may never use it, but it's always a good thing to have on hand. So through the law enforcement component of Project Naloxone, all police departments here in the county participate, all municipal police departments. There's 47 local municipal departments here in the county. There's been over 700 law enforcement officers trained and over 350 naloxone kits distributed. Every police car here in the county carries one of these naloxone kits. It's found right in a pencil case. A lot of police departments actually carry it in their car doors. Inside the pencil case is the naloxone device, a pair of gloves, and a resource card. The training and the programs both endorsed by the District Attorney's Office as well as the Police Chiefs Association, and in accordance with the Act, medical direction is required, meaning you have to have a doctor that oversees the program. Our physician is Dr. Bert Schiffer. He works out of the Phoenixville emergency room. The data that you see here is actually from January of October 2014 to December of last year. There were 81 uses of naloxone and 74 successful reversals. As of today, there's 166 naloxone uses here in the county and 157 successful reversals. The difference in the numbers, there's a couple people who actually weren't on opioids, and the naloxone only works on opioids, so there was no effect on the person, and there were a couple people that actually passed away. The training. A lot of people ask what kind of training is involved for the naloxone. As a community member, bystander, that's interested in obtaining naloxone over the counter, there's actually no required training in the law. So you can, in theory, after this class, go to a pharmacy and say, hey, I would like naloxone, and the pharmacist would give it to you. For law enforcement, there's an 18-minute video that they're required to watch. It's video-based. It's accessed through our distance-based learning system at Good Fellowship. The officer logs on, watches the video at any time from any computer, and they're certified on how to use the naloxone. As part of our program, we actually take it a step further, and we offer a train-the-trainer. So basically, there's an officer at each department that goes over the practical use of the drug. The law itself only requires the distance-based learning portion, the online video. Our program actually incorporates both the cognitive portion, the video-based, as well as a practical portion, psychomotor portion, that allows the officer to get a hands-on idea of how the naloxone drug works. So here's actually a kit of what the naloxone looks like. In each kit, you have a pair of gloves, you have a naloxone device, and you have a resource card. This is actually a zoomed-in picture of what the Amistar naloxone product looks like. You have a pre-filled vial of the naloxone, which is filled with, measured out in that little glass vial. You have a nose piece, and you have an encasing device. Product, or the picture on the bottom left here, is actually a kit taken out and separated. Here's a picture of a resource card. We implemented this in April 2015. The goal of this was actually when a police officer would get dispatched to an overdose, they would take their naloxone kit, they would go into the overdose, they would administer the naloxone. When that person wakes up, the officer would then hand the resource card to a bystander or the patient themselves. The left side of the card explains what opiates are, what an overdose is, as well as what naloxone is. The reverse side of the card actually goes over how to access treatment services that the county offers, both the insured and the uninsured. There are 5 contracted providers, all spread throughout the county. Anyone can call any of those numbers and access the county's services. And the whole goal of this is once the officer administers the naloxone, that person then go and seek treatment. As part of the naloxone program, I encourage all the police officers here in the county that once the naloxone is administered, that the person seeks treatment. They go in the ambulance to the hospital. Naloxone has the potential of wearing off. It can cause withdrawal symptoms, so it's very, very important that the person does go to the hospital and get treatment. Once the officer uses the naloxone, they're required to fill out a replenishment form. The goal of this is actually to collect data. They go online to our website. They fill out a digital form here, ask some simple questions. Where did the naloxone use occur? What township? What drugs do you believe the person took? Was it pain medication? Was it heroin? If it was heroin, how was it used? Was it injected? Was it sniffed? A lot of times an officer will come upon, they get dispatched to an overdose, they may not know what that person took. So in an effort to collect data, I ask what that officer believes that person took. Naloxone only works on opioids, doesn't work on anything else. So if you happen to give it to somebody who's suffering, let's say a diabetic-related emergency, where they've overdosed on another substance such as a benzodiazepine, a Klonopin, Xanax, naloxone has no effect. So it only works on opioids. Basically, once the officer submits this form, I then go out to that department and restock the naloxone. So through the data collection of the naloxone forms, here's a county map of Chester County here by municipality. The darker the shading is actually where the naloxone uses are. So looking at this map, you can see Downingtown, Callan, Coatesville, West Goshen, Westtown, East Goshen. Those are municipalities that have significant naloxone use. I'm not saying that that's where all the drug use occurs. I'm just saying that's where the naloxone uses are occurring. As of today, majority of these municipalities have given naloxone. The map itself has actually shifted. We're seeing a lot of naloxone uses in the Phoenixville area, and we're seeing a lot here in the Westchester Borough area. Just in the past, I would say, year or so, there's been like 20 naloxone uses just in the Phoenixville Borough area. There's a lot of theories. As you can see here, looking at the county map, you have 202 and the 30 bypass that actually cut across the county from west to east or east to west. A lot of these departments actually sit along that corridor there. So naloxone uses by age. As you can see in this pie chart, the most significant population of naloxone uses occurred between the 21 and 30 age group. Okay, that's huge. The second highest population of naloxone uses occurred between the ages of 31 and 40. The youngest person to get naloxone was 17. The oldest was 67. So as you can see, it's not just one age group population that's being affected. It's across all ages. Naloxone uses by gender, as you can see, about 2/3 are male and about 1/3 are female. So in April of 2016, we actually switched to a different naloxone product. What we saw happening is we were seeing departments actually using more than one dose of naloxone. So we actually switched to a different product. This product here is the Adapt product. It's a little bit easier to use. It's a 4 milligram product. Basically, you take it out of the package, you tear back the pouch, you take the product out, hit the plunger, and it sprays. Very, very easy, very, very safe. Again, tear back the package, take the naloxone out, place up the person's nostril, hit the plunger, and it sprays. Very, very easy. Here's kind of a visual demonstration of the mannequin's nostril. Community portion. I do community presentations on naloxone as well as Project Naloxone all over the county. The goal of them is to educate the community on the signs and symptoms of an opiate-related overdose, naloxone, how to obtain naloxone, and how to administer naloxone. In my trainings, I go over not just the intranasal product, but I also go over the auto-injector product. When you go into a pharmacy, they may provide you with the product with the nose piece, they may provide you with the auto-injector. It's all basically what they have in stock or what you request. At every community naloxone presentation, there's a representative from the Department of Drug and Alcohol. At the conclusion of the presentation, they go over the county's treatment services for both the insured and the uninsured. The majority of the people that do actually attend the trainings are parents of addicted children looking to get involved and looking to carry naloxone to have on hand. There's been a lot of success with the naloxone program locally here in Westchester. Here's a Facebook post. On the left here, this was actually an overdose that occurred on a street corner here in the borough. An officer was able to take a dispatch for an opiate-related overdose. They took their naloxone out of their car, placed up the person's nostril, and they were able to give 2 doses to save a 22-year-old male patient. On the other side of the county in Coatesville, like I said, the opiate epidemic just doesn't affect one area. It affects all municipalities here across the county. This is Officer Lang here, Claire Lang. She was able to give naloxone again to save somebody's life. East Brandywine, kind of interesting story. We started the program in October of 2014. They got naloxone in December. They only had naloxone in their car for 4 days. They used it within 4 days. So it's been a great tool in saving lives. This person was 23 years old. They had overdosed on heroin. The officer gave them naloxone, and they were able to save their life. Community member. The community trainings are held not just at Good Fellowship, but all over the county. If you're interested in having community training in your local area, you can always go to our website and request a naloxone training, goodfellowship.org. I've been down to Oxford, been down to Phoenixville, do the program all throughout the county. Here's our website, here's a phone number. This is our phone number at Fellowship. If you're interested in having naloxone training, again, visit our website or you can give us a call.
Anybody have any questions about anything that we talked about tonight? Yes, sir.
Is there, for someone who's over 18, is there a way to force them into some sort of treatment program the same way you can, like 302 someone who may attempt to commit suicide?
There's not right now that I'm aware of. There's not a 302. There's not an involuntary commitment for someone who's dealing with drug addiction. No, there's not.
I can tell you just very quickly that there is legislation that's been introduced, probably more than once, to have just such a thing available. Where that goes, I'm not sure yet, but it's actually, I think it's an active piece of legislation right now.
Sahian.
I've had a couple of patients where families have 302'd them because they did make some kind of threat, and even though the presenting complaint really is substance use as the diagnosis, at some point, sometimes in a heated moment, someone will say something like, I'm going to kill myself, or... Just so everybody knows, a 302 is an involuntary commitment of someone, so against their will, for a mental health issue where they're either a danger to themselves or to others. And so the police or other folks can 302 someone by getting the court to issue an order that says this individual, for these stated reasons, exactly what we were just saying, a danger to themselves or others, has to go in to be evaluated and treated for their mental health issue. Now, what you're touching on is obviously there's a lot of mental health and drug abuse issues going on hand in hand. And those are things that can be a very complicated situation for an individual who's dealing with one or either one, but both together can be particularly difficult. Yeah, and I'm not promoting a 302 as a way to get somebody into treatment, but it is effective sometimes to get someone psychiatrically detained and then have that conversation with them because they're detoxing and they're really uncomfortable. I've seen it work, but you can't fake the 302. Like, they actually have to be demonstrating.
It has to be approved by a delegate. The delegate doesn't approve it.
Right.
Jared.
I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I'm going to.
Go ahead.
We talked about a month or two ago about that immunity law.
Yeah.
And we've had 8 Narcan uses in 4 months.
Yep.
Frequent flyers, always the same, with heroin on them, and needles, and other paraphernalia.
Yeah.
And the DA's office won't let us prosecute.
Yes.
Are we anywhere closer to getting that? Because you can't get people into a program unless sometimes you court mandate them.
Yeah, so let me kind of explain what we're talking about here. The Good Samaritan law originally, I think, was intended to have a situation where, and I would need to review that again to be perfectly clear, but let's say Vince and I, one of us is experiencing the overdose, so we can't call 911. I'm here, I can call 911, I can get help from my friend Vince who's going through the overdose. Maybe I don't call because I have some drugs on me as well, I have some drug paraphernalia on me as well. So I'm scared that I'm going to get locked up. So instead of calling, I try and protect myself and my friend dies. The law was written to encourage that person to call the police because they would not be able, they're literally immune from prosecution for the small amount of drugs or the paraphernalia that they had on them. Again, I said earlier, if they're a drug dealer, that's different. And you can prove that someone's a drug dealer by other factors, the amount of drugs they have on them, money, there's a whole bunch of factors we can use in court to show that. And what I would need to review again is exactly, the law I think was intended originally to protect one of us in that scenario. And if I recall correctly, again, I'd have to look at this to confirm it, but I think it was intended to protect me, the caller,
because you were
the
like
caller, because I was going to be in a position where I was, maybe I was not going to be encouraged to call the police. The courts in Pennsylvania to this point, and part of the reason why we have said we can't prosecute it is because the courts here in Chester County have broadened it to both of us. So the person who is experiencing the overdose, who the police are being called for to save, if he has drugs on him as well, the court has read this law, and that's their job, is to interpret the law, to mean that it covers both of us, not just one of us. That is currently on appeal out of another county, not out of Chester County, and the way that works is that basically the first county to appeal something kind of gets first dibs at handling it on the appellate level for the entire state. That decision, to my knowledge, has not been rendered yet. The appeal courts can easily take over a year. But that more expansive reading of the Good Samaritan law has now expanded the individuals who are immune from prosecution to include both the person calling and the person who's experiencing the overdose. Now, what Jerry was saying, as far as you see, oftentimes we've seen now people who have had naloxone administered to them more than once. And one of the frustrations for law enforcement is that if they cannot prosecute that person for a crime, which would then put them in the criminal justice system, which would then mean that they have to answer to a judge for drug treatment and follow up on that drug treatment evaluation. If they're not being prosecuted, it's now on them. And if they don't want to seek treatment or they're not prepared to try and seek treatment, there's no other outside organization to force them to get that treatment. And that is what Jerry's talking about. So that's a little bit of the history as to where we got, how we got to this point. But in terms of the answer, has the appeals court made a final decision? No, they have not. So what that means is the interpretation where it applies to both of us is what is still the law that we have to go by. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Something I noticed, I mean, I'm kind of new to being as aware as I am now of all this stuff. And one of the things that when you were speaking, you were very clear to delineate there's heroin and there is opiates.
Yes.
Why do you keep on, like, why do we have to make that distinction? Because it seems to me like with something like marijuana, right? We have medical marijuana and we have marijuana, but they're both called marijuana, so it's the danger is still there.
The distinction is for a couple of reasons. One, they're different things. The opiates are a pill. Heroin is not a pill. Heroin is generally taken in another form. But most importantly, probably, heroin is what's considered a controlled substance. It is inherently illegal. No one can have heroin. There's no legitimate reason for a person to have heroin. The opiates are they're substances that the population can have if they have the proper prescription for it. So an individual can legally have oxycodone if that is something that they are prescribed by a doctor. So that's part of the reason why we view it as two different things.
It just seems to me that by calling it something different, it's almost like a marketing thing, right? I have a marketing business and I think of that immediately, like they market it at a different name, so the dangerousness of it is kind of deferred, and maybe just calling it what it is, you know, medical heroin, would maybe get people to realize how dangerous this stuff really is when they're looking at it. I mean, I think part of it is just perception. These things are safe, these things aren't, but they're both dangerous.
Well, it's the source that they come from. These are drugs that do have a legitimate purpose. Opioids have a legitimate purpose when they are prescribed and used appropriately. The danger is that we have a lot of these opioids in the general population now, and they are being abused. So, but I understand your point. Any other questions? Well, thank you.
What's being done to support law enforcement and first responders who are constantly exposed to the trauma of people overdosing?
The trauma for the officers. Well, yeah, law enforcement and first responders, that's an incredibly difficult job for everyone to have. Everyone who does that, one of the highest honors of my job is that I get to work with the men and women who do that, because they're subjecting themselves to the worst things that you could possibly imagine. The worst day of your life is their average work day. So there are support groups within law enforcement that are available for law enforcement to go to, and they're very well established. Our individual police departments all have support groups within the access to support groups within their departments, and then the county has an organization, and Chief Gleason is here from West Goshen. I think it's called the Schism. CISM, which is basically a group of law enforcement officials who are available for a police officer who needs some help because they're dealing with the trauma of their job. So those are well-established options and resources for police officers and first responders.
But the officer has to search that out, and the first responder has to search that out,
Correct.
whereas there isn't like a continual education around.
There's a much greater awareness of that issue, not just for people who are in law enforcement and first responders seeing individuals overdosing, but all the other terrible things that they see: car crashes, violence, the horror of their daily life. There's a much greater awareness, but it is something that if that's affecting someone, they go and seek it out. It's not required by law.
Now, I can say that when the naloxone bill first came out, was first signed, there's been a distinct change. Initially, just in terms of just training the law enforcement officers on naloxone, I had some officers who were like, "Oh, we're never going to use this. What is the point of this? We're just going to use it on a drug addict who's just going to use it again and again and again." That perception has changed. In the beginning, I had departments who refused to participate in the naloxone program for that reason.
Every single police department in this county participates, and I think probably more than any other segment of the population, the police and the EMS are the ones who really understand the scope of this problem, because they're the ones who, when somebody needs help, who do you call? You call 911, and they always answer. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time tonight, and have a good evening.